Excellent. Session is live. Well, welcome to the Modern Endpoint Management Summit afternoon session. If you're in Europe, or the morning session, if you're across the pond. It's great to be back with you. We've got a really awesome session coming up, in my opinion. So we hope you're going to enjoy it. Just want to say a quick thanks again to our sponsors who, without this event, wouldn't happen. So thanks to Recast Software, who are actually going to join us at the end of this session and have a slot telling us about all their cool products. So welcome, Martin Wheeler. Good to have you with us in this hour. Thanks also to Software Central, Metis, Minecore, NextThink, Acronis, Patch My PC, Fashion, and Microsoft as our guest sponsor. So, what treats are you in for in this session? So we're going to be talking about preparing a new tenant for device management. We're going to maybe talk about this for 35, 40 minutes and then hand over to Marty. My name is Ben Whitmore. If you haven't seen me before in this summit, I'm a senior cloud consultant and I work for a company called Cloudway. And I have Dujon with me. Dujon, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi all. So my name's Dujon Walsham. So I'm an endpoint manager architect, also current MVP in enterprise mobility as well. And yeah, currently the moderator for this exciting presentation we have here today.
Awesome. Good to have you with us. So all the hard questions Dujon's going to answer, and I'm going to sit back and enjoy the ride. Thanks for being with us. So, prepare a new tenant for device management. So what did I have in mind when I was thinking up this session? Well, it occurred to me that quite often as endpoint architects or endpoint consultants or admins who work with Intune, sometimes we just get told to go and configure devices with Intune now. So maybe you've been using Config Manager or another piece of software to manage your devices, and your boss says, okay, here's Intune, here's some licenses, go and configure some stuff, okay? Now, as a consultant, I work with many customers, and we sometimes see gaps where maybe admins have run a bit too quick into the endpoint side, configuring policy, compliance, and that's all great stuff. But sometimes we see some gaps. So hopefully in this session, I'm going to maybe highlight some of those gaps. Hopefully you haven't got them in your environment, but if you have, nobody's going to tell. And you can maybe take some of this information away, have a look what's going on in your tenant, and maybe address it with the teams. So that is my goal. That is my takeaway for this session. We don't want any curveballs to happen once we've configured our tenant for device management. I mean, that can be, so what do I mean by that? So your boss may have said, well, go and configure Intune to manage Windows devices, okay? And you go off and you configure it. You think, okay, I need some compliance policies for Windows devices. I need some conditional access for Windows devices. I need some configuration profiles and maybe need to configure autopilot. And then another curveball comes along and says, well, we need to do Android now. And then, so what we're going to try and show you is think of these things, and then maybe you won't have to claw back on yourself and repeat some other workloads. If you maybe thought them in the first place, that's a good time to have caught that. So what am I going to ask you to know? I'm going to ask you to know your users. Okay. And by that, I mean, who are you providing your solution for when you're configuring Intune? Okay. Because all of our users have different requirements, and that can range from the devices they're using. Okay. It could be the licenses they're using, the platforms they're using, the data they're accessing, where they're accessing data from. So your office workers may be accessing corporate data in Office 365 from a Windows device, sitting in an office behind a corporate firewall, and everything's rosy. But then you may also have a contingent in your business who are frontline workers, and their devices are not secured in the same way. So maybe you have to think slightly differently in how you provide a solution for those users. So that's really key. And when you're having this conversation about which users you're trying to provide a solution for, that should not just be an IT conversation. You need to get in other stakeholders in the business involved. So maybe pull in HR into that meeting, okay, or legal as well, and the IT department, and have this talk together. I want you to understand what your IT colleagues' requirements are, because the last thing we want to do is give everybody in the IT team global admin access. It's just not a great approach. So the help desk, for example, does the help desk staff need global admin privilege? Well, I'd say no. And then I'd say, well, okay, is the Azure role help desk administrator sufficient for them? Okay, so they can read data, reset passwords, read BitLocker keys. So that may be sufficient for them. But then what if we're asking our help desk staff to reset authentication methods for Azure AD, for MFA? Well, then suddenly the help desk administrator role may not be enough. Okay, so think about the different team responsibilities you have within IT and scope their roles and permissions appropriately. I always recommend kind of least privilege is what we should be going for. Okay. Another thing that you should be thinking of as well before you embark on any configuration is the type of licenses you have. Okay, and this will dictate what you can actually configure. So if you're, for example, a small business, you've got less than 300 users, maybe the M365 Business Premium license is perfect for the business. Okay, especially now it contains Defender for Business as well. And so within the Microsoft 365 Business Premium, we have an Intune license, we have an ADP1 license, so that's cool. But what if your business has asked you to ensure that any risk from their users logging in is flagged, and we have to do an action? So if we see a risky user, maybe we want to block them or force them to change the password or force them to MFA. Okay, if you want to go into that kind of level of detail with conditional access, then maybe they need an ADP2 license. And then you have to think, well, do all of my users need an ADP2 license? Well, maybe my help desk staff do, because I want to use privileged identity management so they can just-in-time access into a role, but maybe my frontline workers don't. So certainly think about the licenses you have. Sometimes if you have a license, so like an E5 or an ADP2 license, it will light up a feature in your tenant. But just be careful, because if that feature is then suddenly in scope for all of your users, and you're audited and you're not licensed, that can get you in trouble. So just think about the licenses you have. Hardware, absolutely. Which hardware are you deploying these solutions to? Which Windows devices are you deploying? Which iOS devices are you deploying? And not only what are you deploying today, what is that hardware estate going to look like in 6 months or 12 months? Okay. If I have, I don't know, 1,000 iPhones in the business today that I'm enrolling into Intune, okay, are they iPhone 11, 12, XR, 8, 7, 6? The life cycle for each of those iOS versions changes. So what I may be rolling out today, I may have a subset of users whose device is no longer going to be able to be managed by Intune because I can't get the latest iOS on it. And I'm maybe going to have to buy a whole load of new iPhones in 6 months' time. So as an IT admin, you kind of need to forward forecast and think, okay, what is my hardware estate going to look like in maybe 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years? Okay, that just helps with licensing. It means you don't have to go begging to the IT boss to say, hey, look, boss, we've got 500 iPhones we need to buy this month. Doesn't go down well in the conversation. Software, really critical. You may be transitioning from Configuration Manager to Intune. You may be starting off Greenfield, but either way, you're going to have an application portfolio that you need to manage. So you go off, you start creating software. Maybe you're creating Win32 apps in Intune. Okay, but how are you going to update those apps? Have you got a plan in place? Are you working with a partner to ensure that those third-party apps are kept up to date. Because as we know, if you're not updating Windows, it's a bad thing. But also, if you're not updating your software, that is also a bad thing. Okay, and there's been many examples in the past where software hasn't been patched, especially third-party software, and it's led to a backdoor. Ransomware comes in. It's not a great day in the office. So think about how you're going to manage that software as well. Another thing that you should be considering is the governance requirements for your business. So what industry are you working in? Are you governed by GDPR, or are there other governance requirements on your organization? Because that will dictate how you roll out any solution. Okay, it'll dictate your security policies. It'll dictate your compliance policies. What passwords are you expecting the users to use on the device? Is a 4-digit PIN sufficient, or does it have to be a 6-digit PIN, or does it have to be a complex password? So you really need to understand, and this is why you have to work with other stakeholders like the legal department to understand, you're securing your devices appropriately for the industry that you're in. And lastly, on this slide, technology. Okay, how are you going to support this? What support are you getting from the business in order for you to be able to support Intune? Are you looking at training courses? Are you looking at certification? So just think about that as well. And what I sometimes see is where we have somebody in an IT department who's really good at learning new stuff, yeah, and they're natural with the cloud. But there may be other people in the team who are maybe a bit slower, maybe a bit more resistant to change. So it's really important to think, how do you get everybody in the team on board with this idea that we're kind of moving stuff to the cloud, get them all on board and playing a role in that. So really important, that one. So there's some things to think about. Some of the kind of the fluffy things, they're important, but they're things to think about. So let's move on now to some of the gaps that I see when tenants are being configured. So this is specifically talking maybe Azure AD as the foundation. So Azure AD is the foundation. Identity for me in the cloud is the foundation for everything we do. So we must get this right. And so I talk about building a strong foundation. And the first thing that we often see, and people laugh at this, branding. Well, I think branding is important, because when your users are signing into services or accessing the company portal from devices, they need to know they're landing in the right place. Okay, so if they get a phishing email and they're asked to sign into Microsoft 365, you can actually, as part of your communication plan and your anti-phishing campaign, get your users familiar with your business logos, your color schemes, so they've got half a chance of knowing that they're in the right place. But not only that, when they're in the company portal on devices and they click on support, they're getting all the correct information they need to contact you if there's an issue. So what that may look like in a tenant, if we go into Azure AD, we want to look at company branding over here on the left. Make sure we've got company branding configured. And Microsoft tell you the size of the pictures that you have to configure for branding. It's all quite clear. Make sure you follow it. These images should be as good as you can get them for the size that is required of you, to make sure it looks good for the user. Okay, I'm going to show you an example of where branding looks bad. So make sure you configure Azure AD. It's especially important if you're considering autopilot in your environment. But then also make sure you're configuring branding the same in Intune. Simple stuff, but it matters. So in Intune, you want to go to tenant administration and customization. Just make sure you've got the same logos and the same color schemes in here. I purposely haven't done that. And so I've got a really bad logo here for this tenant. It's not the size that Microsoft have recommended. And if I was to go into one of my devices now, open the company portal app, you can see that logo. It just looks, if I can zoom in a bit, just looks horrendous. Okay. Logos are my thing. Logos have to look good. Again, it doesn't take a lot to make the logos look good. When you click on help, you get the contact information. So branding, pretty important for me as far as I'm concerned. Collaboration settings is another gap that we see not configured on a tenant. So by default, guests have permissions that maybe you don't want them to have. Okay. Guests have the same access to Azure AD resources as members do. Guests can see memberships of all non-hidden groups, so that's the default option when you sign up for a new tenant. Or guests can only view their own user profile. They can't see the memberships of any groups. So that third option would be my recommendation in the Azure portal. So to find that, we jump back into Azure, into Azure AD. And we want to look at user settings on the left-hand side. Have a look at manage external collaboration settings. And this is where we're talking about guest access, okay? So maybe you want to think about limiting what guests can see in your directory. So you can do that in the GUI. You can also do it via the graph as well. So if you head over to Graph Explorer, aka.ms/GE, there's some cool endpoints you can configure this on. Depending on the value we use in graph, depends on the setting that gets changed. So these decks are going to be made available. So I'm not going to dwell on these, but certainly take these away and have a look at those settings. Application consent, another gap that we see. This is really big. This is where users are just surfing the internet, finding web apps, and they get given the option to sign into that web app with their Azure AD account, with their work account. And the user thinks, cool, that means I don't have to think of another username and password to get into this other third-party service. Well, just be careful, because by default in the tenant, users are able to consent to app requests. Okay, so when an application requests consent, it gives you their user identity, the application name that they're consenting to, but also tells you whether the publisher of the application is verified. And if it's a dodgy app, often as not, that's not been verified by Microsoft or your organization. So keep an eye out for the blue badge. Blue badge is normally safe. It means your organization or Microsoft have approved that publisher. Who's published it? Is it your organization? Is it Microsoft, or is it a third party? Keep an eye out for that. But quite often with these dodgy apps, they're going to ask for access to data, your data that they do not need. So kind of the lowest permission they're probably going to want to do is just read your profile, sign in and read your profile. But we do see application consent requests where it asks, for example, to send email on behalf of the user or have access to the user's file. And here's an example of what a dodgy app consent may look like. You know, the application name to me looks a bit dodgy. It's not coming from a verified publisher. And look at this, look, it wants full access to my files. So I don't want my users to be consenting to this kind of application. There's just no need for it. So in the Azure portal, make sure that you're locking this down. So you want to be going to Enterprise Applications, User Settings, and switch on Admin Consent Requests for applications, okay? So go and spend some time in here, read the Microsoft Docs and understand what this is. So admins have to consent to those application requests. You can go to consent and permissions on the left-hand side and allow users to consent for apps that have low permissions, okay? So that's perfectly feasible. So if an application is just asking to read a user's profile, let the user do that themselves. Don't generate a help desk ticket. So spend some time looking at external collaboration. I'm going through this quickly because I'm looking at the clock. Group creation. By default, all users can create Microsoft 365 and security groups in the Azure AD tenant. I've seen this happen. Microsoft say let them happen, let it happen because it leads to great collaboration between users. Okay, it may also lead to something that we call team sprawl, where users are creating groups left, right, and center, and then users don't know which groups to collaborate in. Okay, so maybe you want to just focus on a bit of user training, or maybe you actually want to restrict who can create groups in your tenant. So those admin roles, like the Teams admin, SharePoint admin, Global admin, they're going to be able to create roles, but you can use PowerShell to lock down which members are able to create groups. So certainly go away and think about that. Diagnostic settings. Okay, this is always missed. Unless you're configuring update compliance in Intune, this is nearly always missed in Azure AD. So what do I mean by that? Well, in Azure AD, you enable diagnostic settings and you upload your audit logs and sign-in logs for Azure AD to log analytics. Okay. As soon as you do that, it opens up a whole new world of different workbooks so you can visually see what's going on inside the organization. Okay. So we really want to just enable audit logs and sign-in logs initially so we get a good feel for it. But there are other logs we can send to log analytics and get some really cool workbooks to visualize that data. So let me jump into the console and show you what that looks like. Azure AD, diagnostic settings. You can create up to 5 different diagnostic settings to send these logs to different locations. Okay, so here's one I created earlier. So I just ticked audit logs and sign-in logs. I picked the subscription where my log analytics workspace was. Okay, then if I head over to log analytics, once I've configured diagnostic settings, head over to that workspace and I can see the logs and I can start to see the sign-in logs uploaded and the audit logs uploaded. So then if I'm really good at custom query language, I can get some really funky queries here just to try and visualize my data and what's going on. But as soon as you enable this, you also get some really cool workbooks. Okay. So if I go back to Azure AD and look at workbooks, I've got some cool workbooks that have already been created for me. So here's some sign-in analysis, and I can start to see some stuff where people are logging in from, how many people are coming in from the UK, blah, 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 blah. Diagnostic settings, definitely go away and configure that. The ingest into log analytics is, I think it's free up to 5 gigs, and then it's like pence afterwards, depending on the size of the organization. I pretty much say to customers, it's free, maybe some little extra. So it's not a big expense for your organization. Security defaults, not missed as often anymore. When you spin up a new tenant, Microsoft are actually trying to protect you, because before security defaults, if you create a new tenant, it's the world and his oyster has got access, unless you start locking down straight away with conditional access. Okay, so security defaults is kind of designed for organizations who want to increase their security posture, but maybe they don't have a security team to start going and configuring a really awesome conditional access policies for them. Okay, so security defaults does enable some conditional access rules, but they're quite basic. So it will require all users to register for MFA within 14 days is one example. All admins have to MFA. It will block legacy authentication at conditional access level, not Exchange Online level. It will block it in conditional access. And there's pretty much it. It protects privileged activities as well, like logging into the Azure portal or Azure PowerShell. But when you roll out your Intune solution, you're going to want a much more diverse conditional access policy. So we recommend switching it off and deploying your own conditional access. Your own conditional access should be designed very well. Another reason why Microsoft enables security defaults is to force MFA, because there are some pretty scary stats. 99% of organization account compromise could be prevented by enabling MFA. Okay, and we're going to maybe mention conditional access in a minute if I get some time. So security defaults, good intentions, but I think you want to create your own conditional access, and this is what we come on to next. Conditional access design are really important. I always tell people, go and see what Klaus Jespersen is doing at Microsoft. He's got some really cool examples, a really cool approach to the way he builds conditional access with personas. I've put the link on there. Go and spend some time on it and build out some really cool conditional access policies that protects your users coming from different devices, accessing different data. Spend some time on some really good conditional access design. Conditional access for me it's the gateway into the identity. So in the old days, we used to have firewalls that protected our devices. Nowadays, our identity's in the cloud. We want to protect the identity at all costs. So maybe we're not all licensed for MCAS. So conditional access is kind of our keys to the kingdom. Spend time on getting it right. Have a look at Klaus's examples. Here's another thing that people tend to miss with conditional access. So insights and reporting and overview in Azure AD console is really good. It gives you some really rich statistics, and it tells you where there are gaps in your conditional access policies. So go and spend some time in the console as well. I'm just going to jump out to the console and show you that. So we want to go to security, conditional access, just have a look at the overview. So it gives us some really quick snippets of maybe what we're doing wrong in the organization. Then we can drive deeper and have a look at some insights and reporting and look through these visual workbooks, just see what's going on. Where are people logging in from? Where have I got gaps in conditional access? Okay. Are people accessing stuff they shouldn't? And maybe I've missed something in my conditional access policy. Spend some time in there. Okay. Just looking at the time. We're good. Conditional access. Okay. Just gone into the console. And again, if you're good at Custo, expand on the existing workbooks and create your own languages, your own queries. Break glass admin accounts. I should have put this first. This is really, really important. Stuff can happen. Stuff can break. You can lock yourself out of the tenant with bad conditional access design. If all of your users are required to log into Azure with MFA, what if the MFA service breaks? It did once back in 2019. So what we say is create a break glass admin account. So this is a highly privileged account. It should be a global admin. Nobody should use this account. It's for emergency situations only. If you've locked yourself at the tenant, if MFA is broken, whatever the reason, have an account on standby. The break glass admin account, exclude it from your conditional access policies. It should not be an account that you log in with day to day to perform your admin function. The password should be locked away in a key safe, and you should audit when that account is being used. Okay, so we've already talked about the diagnostic settings and sending your sign-in logs to Log Analytics. Well, set some alerts up in Log Analytics to tell you when the break glass admin account is being used. Okay, it should only be used in emergencies, but it may get you out of a hole. Okay, the break glass admin account, we recommend rotating the password as well, just good practice, but make the password complex. And it should only be, as with all admin accounts, in my opinion, it should be cloud only. Should not be a synchronized account from your on-prem. And in the decks that we share later, you'll be able to see how to set some alerts up in Log Analytics to let you know when the break glass admin account is being used. Okay, we're good for time. Privileged accounts. We just touched on this in the last snippet, talking about break glass admin. So do not synchronize your highly privileged roles like global admin, Intune admin. Do not synchronize them from on-premise. Okay, if a bad actor gets hold of your password on-premise, that password is synchronized via AD connected to Azure AD. Yeah, that bad actor then has access to your Office 365 Intune portal. Okay, and they can do whatever they want with that permission. They can wipe devices. They can grab data at the tenant. They can wipe the tenant. Okay, so this just avoids that kind of lateral attack. If somebody grabs those on-prem credentials, maybe they've got a password sniffer on an IT device, seeing it. Cloud only accounts for those highly privileged admin roles, please. Finish those graphics off. Never sync your accounts. Never leave those privileged accounts unprotected. Always protect them with MFA. When we're talking about admin accounts as well, I recommend not leaving them with that permission all the time. Just-in-time access. So here we're talking about privileged identity management. Give all your admin roles an ADP2 license and make them elevate into the role they require. Okay, so definitely look at PIM. I'm not going to go through that in a lot of detail, just other than to call it out. Use PIM for all your admin roles. Okay, and I think this might be the last one that I focus on before we maybe do some Q&A. This one is the biggest. This is the most horrible one that I see, and this one is nearly always left open because Legacy protocols. Okay, Microsoft are switching off legacy protocols in October this year. So even if you have this gap, it's going to be closed by Microsoft. They've been wanting to close it for a long time, but people are still using it. So it has legacy protocols have been switched off on tenants that aren't using it. And when we talk about legacy protocols, we're talking about basic authentication into Exchange Online. Okay, and so when I talk to some admins, they say, well, Ben, in conditional access, I've got a conditional access policy that blocks legacy protocols. It's like, well, yes, but have you disabled basic authentication in Exchange Online? Because when you authenticate to Exchange Online with IMAP or POP3 or Authenticated SMTP, that authentication happens. That first factor happens in Exchange Online. And only then, when it is successful, it will then be analyzed by conditional access. Okay, so an attacker will come in, they'll buy a leaked username and password off the dark web. You can buy thousands for a couple of dollars, and they're going to try your organization to see if you have basic auth enabled. And if they get a right combination of username and password, they're going to get a signal back to say this was successful. And then they maybe hit your conditional access policy and are blocked. Okay, but they've got a successful username and password combination. So they can use other lateral techniques to get inside your organization, spearfish your users. So absolutely make sure legacy protocols are disabled in your environment if you're not using it. And I'll talk about that in detail as we go through the next couple of slides. So have a look at Azure AD sign-in logs, okay? So here's one we made earlier where I haven't got it disabled. So in Azure AD, look at the sign-in logs, add a filter for client app, and just look at some of the legacy protocols. Maybe tick all of these legacy authentication clients, okay? If you're getting stuff coming back here, then you've got basic authentication enabled in Exchange Online, okay? You're not using modern auth, and you really need to address this, okay? There may be a use case to allowing authenticated SMTP. So authenticated SMTP will still be allowed from October. Microsoft aren't closing that protocol down. And use that sparingly for service accounts, maybe multi-function devices that are sending emails, but maybe look to pull that back, okay? And if you do have service accounts like multi-function devices that are required to use Authenticated SMTP, maybe use conditional access so that they can only do that sign-in from a trusted location, for example, okay? Don't leave it open. And then you say, well, okay, Ben, how do I know if basic authentication is enabled in Exchange Online? Well, you want to connect to Exchange Online PowerShell module. And the first thing you want to do is type in get organization config. I'm just going to select any field that has the word auth in it. Okay, so the one you're looking for is default authentication policy. Okay, I've got a default authentication policy that will apply to all of my Exchange users if they don't have an explicit authentication policy on their mailbox. Okay, and generally, not many people use authentication policies. They leave it to the default one. So this default policy is blocking basic authentication. I can do get authentication policy. Here we go. So here's my authentication policies. Here's my block basic authentication policy, and you can see all of the basic auth protocols are disabled on my tenant. So those threat actors can't use that username and password combination to probe my Exchange Online, okay? And I've got another authentication policy down here called allow SMTP, where I've got basic auth SMTP is enabled. And I would assign this authentication policy to the service account that requires authenticated SMTP, not the rest of my users. And if I was to go into a tenant that didn't have basic auth blocks, and I did the same command, select auth. Okay, in this tenant, I have no default authentication policy. Basic auth isn't disabled. I'm at real risk there of people trying to access my tenant. And if you see this disabled, you more than likely see in your sign-in logs attempts to access the IMAP protocol or the POP3 protocol and you're going to get connections in from countries that you have no idea why they're coming from there. And that's threat actors trying to get into your environment. So disable legacy protocols in your tenant. Absolutely. Microsoft are going to switch it off anyway. And if you're not looking at this today, you're going to have a big surprise in October because it'll be switched off and then it's going to be panic stations. Okay. You'll be running around thinking, what's going on? Exchange is broken. So key points for legacy protocol is filter the sign-in logs to view legacy protocol usage in your environment. Create an authentication policy in Exchange Online to block basic auth. Create authentication policies to maybe allow authenticated SMTP for those multi-function devices, but also use conditional access to maybe lock down the locations they can access Exchange from. For example, a trusted office location, trusted IP address. And remember, basic auth is switched off in October, whether you like it or not. So you need to be taking action on this now and looking at those sign-in logs. And the other thing that you can maybe do to bolster your position, and this kind of goes maybe more into like an app protection kind of conversation. If you're allowing users to access corporate email on the native mail apps on a Android phone or an iOS device, then as an organization, you have no control over that data. Okay, if that device is lost or stolen, or that user decides to leave the company, you've got no control over that data. If they decide to copy corporate data to the personal, you've got no control over that data. So I certainly encourage you to consider looking at app protection policies in Intune to force that encryption bubble around the applications, force the user to use the Outlook app, force an app protection policy, and then you as an admin have control over that corporate data. You can set a policy that says, yes, you can go and use corporate email on your personal device. You must use the Outlook app. I'm going to force an app protection policy, and I'm not going to let you save corporate data onto the personal side of your phone. I'm not going to allow you to copy and paste data from the corporate application, from a corporate email, into your Facebook post. Okay. So certainly look at leveraging conditional access and app protection policies in Intune to prevent that kind of data leakage. Okay, I've maybe just got a couple of seconds to show this slide. App protection policies, what we were just talking about. So prevent corporate data leakage, encrypt the corporate data on a personal device. And here we're not talking about managing a user's personal device. We don't want to do that. Okay, we don't want that control and that visibility on a user's personal device, but we do want control over corporate data. And with an app protection policy, we can actually say you cannot access corporate data if you have a jailbroken device. Okay, so we can do some really cool stuff with conditional launch. If the user's account is disabled, we can wipe corporate data. If their device is offline for a certain period of time, we can block access to corporate data, okay, without having control of their personal device. So certainly go away and look at app protection policies in Intune. It's a fantastic feature. You're licensed to use it if you have an Intune license, okay? Bring back control of your corporate data. And so I'm going to finish up there, I think, because I really want to give Marty some time to talk about the Recast software excellent suite of tools they have, and they've got some really cool stuff, and I want to give them time to show you that. So all I'd say is a takeaway, we went through a lot of stuff. Have a look at those slides, have a look through each of those points afterwards, and certainly give consideration to each of them. We see those things missed time and time again. Make sure that you don't have those holes in your environment, and that you're in good standing to then go and prepare and configure your Intune environment and make your users' experience awesome. Just like this guy is feeling awesome now as he's about to jump into that lake. I just love that picture. I just thought it was a great slide to end on. So thanks for listening. I'm just having a look at the chat quickly, see if there's any questions to answer.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions that just came in.
Nobody's told me to get off the mic yet, so that's encouraging.
Yeah.
Cool. Have you answered the questions, or
I've answered one of them, so there's a couple that's just come through. Okay,
so there's a question there about PIM hindering IT access. Not really. So you don't have to get somebody else to justify why you're PIMing into a role. So when you PIM into a role as you want to PIM into global admin, you can give them a 1, 2, 4, 8 hour window that they can then use that privileged role. They don't have to keep re-PIMing every time they do something in the console. They get that privilege with the token. Okay, and it just means that when they go home for the day, that privilege isn't going to be there overnight for somebody else to use and possibly go and do some bad stuff in the system. So it doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't hinder them. For me, I'd rather have that highly privileged account protected with MFA, PIMing into the role. It's not a big ask for my admin to do that. For me personally, that's what I think. And it's giving you super protection over your environment. How to reset a test tenant and start over? I don't think I've seen a script that it does that. If you've got a test tenant, just bin it and sign up for a new test tenant. You can actually get a Microsoft 365 E5 dev tenant free of charge for 90 days, and you can extend that 90 days if you keep using it. So I think Nathan McCulty on Twitter has got a pinned post on how to do that, how to set up a free tenant for testing. So go away and do that. Okay, I think that just about covers the Q&A there. Cool. So thanks for listening. Marty, I'm going to hand over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. Thank you
Good to have
very
you with
much.
us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am going to see if I can grab the screen here real quick, and we'll talk a little bit about, we'll see what happens here. We're going to talk a little bit about right-click tools, and we're going to start with our favorite welcome to this part of the session. Thanks, everyone, for joining. And let's see if I can actually click to move forward. Yeah, that's me. Hi, in cartoon form. Hey, everyone, I'm a solution engineer here at Recast Software. And you may know us better as the creator, the people who are involved with the right-click tools. So we're going to talk just a little bit about right-click tools today. And then a couple of pain points that we can solve in our config manager environment. We'll see if y'all have any questions about all of that stuff, and then we'll just kind of go ahead. So we have 3 pillars of right-click tools that are kind of how we think about how our tools should work. And I'm not going to make you memorize this, because right now I'm actually going to go switch and I'm going to go look at, hopefully we'll go over to one of my demo, maybe not, doesn't like me this moment. There we go. What I wanted to do was come over here and just look at one of my demo config manager consoles to show what right-click tools is. If you don't know anything about the right-click tools at all, it is a community tool. There is a community component to it, so you can download this, you can install it, and use our productivity tools. As you know, it's free. It's part of how this all works. So you can actually, things like client actions, where you can do all of those things that you used to have to go to the config manager control panel to do, like machine policy retrievals, hardware inventories. You can actually do those remotely against devices. So you can do that right from inside the right-click tools right here. And when you do something like a hardware inventory, there are a couple of these tools that'll actually ask you, would you like to do a full hardware inventory cycle? So you're completely replacing what's in the hardware inventory, or do you just want to do a delta? And our yes and no doesn't necessarily make explain that real well, but essentially it's asking, would you like to do a full or would you like to do a delta of these 2 things? And you can make your decision on what you'd like to do. So on our 3 pillars that we showed, no, we don't want to do a full hardware inventory. We'll just do a delta on that one. And then it'll essentially tell you that it's done. And then it queues it up to go ahead and start that inventory and get it sent back into the config manager database. So that's one of our 3 pillars, the improved productivity. So you can actually do things against devices right inside the console. You don't have to go other places to find out things like, I'm just going to show off a tool here, to find out things like system information about a device. System information is going to give you all kinds of info about the device that you clicked on. I'm in our community tools, so this is all part of the community tools. And you may see things like this appear that say it's limited to one device, and you can get more information about going to enterprise. But this is all available to use as a community user. The next one on our 3 pillars, well, this is going to take a little while, so I'm going to close out right there. The next one is our Actionable Insights, and that one we're going to go a little bit deeper on, and we need the enterprise version in order to take a look at this one. But I want to show you what our software update deployment status looks like. So one of the questions that we were going to answer in our 10 or 15 minutes here was, how can I tell what my software update compliance looks like in my environment? And so what we wanted to know that. And so we actually came up with the software update deployment status dashboard. And the idea here is that you can actually take a collection. I'm going to grab our workstations collection, and you can compare compliance against one or more software update groups if you want to. So we right now we do all of ours as an automatic deployment rule that gathers things monthly. So you can kind of see which month we're looking at. And then once they're more than 3 months old, we just go ahead and throw them into an older updates if they still exist. I'm going to grab March. I could also, if I wanted to, grab like January as well. But I'm just going to go ahead and do March. And when I click start over here, what it's actually going to show us is which devices, according to this collection and this software update group, are compliant or not compliant. Now, the second pillar is Actionable Insight. So the idea is that we can actually see all of these devices that have or have not applied their updates. So in this group, I've actually got the 22 that have applied their updates I can click on, or I can click on the 7 that haven't applied their updates, and I can also see which updates those are missing. But I can also move around my data a little bit here so that it shows me some more interesting things or more ways that I can actually, that might be helpful as an admin. Now, almost all organizations I've ever worked with, we don't do 0-day update deployment. And I know there's probably even some people at our at Recast that would say, no, you need to do it on the first day. But a lot of places that I've worked, we've waited either as much as 21 days or as little as 7 days before updates start going out, just to make sure that everything looks good from Microsoft's point of view on those updates. So what you can actually do with this slider is this will help in your organization. If, for example, this is just an example, if you wait 31 days to do your update, you can actually take a look. So let's just say you wait a month before you make updates required in your environment. This would actually make it so that you can see what that would look like based on, I don't really need to know about updates that are older than, or I only want to know about updates that are older than 31 days. This helps with that huge dip that can happen when all of your devices update and they connect to Config Manager, and Config Manager after Patch Tuesday's got all these great new updates, and all of a sudden your compliance numbers look like they dip down into 0, right? Because you haven't deployed the updates yet, or you haven't made them required. So very few computers are doing them. So that's what this slider can actually do. So you can take a snapshot and actually look at when, what your environment looks like based on how long you send out, it takes you to send out deployments. We're going to go back to 0 days just so we can see these. So what it's looking at here for compliance is it's actually looking against the Config Manager database to say, are there devices that are compliant and are there devices that are not compliant? And how that's defined by the software update deployment status dashboard is, has it installed all the updates that it thinks it needs to, based on what I've selected in the software update group and in the collection? Or is there something that still hasn't been installed? It seems pretty easy, but there's a couple of things that we actually do show that might actually help in a little bit more complex scenario, because if you notice, we can limit it to deployed updates right up here. And what that'll change is that will change what our pie charts look like. But underneath here, this is where I can actually see updates that the computer thinks it needs. And some of them you can see are deployed and some of them are not. So limit to deployed updates will change what shows up here. But this is actually kind of a little bit of a sanity check, I would say, for our administrators, because it actually happened to us a couple of months ago. For some reason, our automatic deployment rule did not collect that there was a servicing stack update that needed to be deployed. So I could actually look here and see that there was a servicing stack that needed to be, that the computer thought that it needed, but deployed was listed as false, which was a quick way to me to go, oh, hey, I better make sure I get that into my update group and get that deployed so that our computers can actually finish doing their deployment, right? Because you want to get that servicing stack a lot of times first, if you can. So showing updates here that need to be deployed, and then being able to take a look with what's going on here. The nice thing, so the other thing that we said actionable insights, right? So what you can actually do to get more information about these or to start doing actions against them is when you right click on any of these devices, you can now have access to our right click tools again. So you have our client actions or our client tools. I'm going to show you one, because if you remember from our slide just a second ago, it was, how do we get users to install updates when they don't want to or just haven't or something like that? Under client tools, we actually have this install missing software updates feature. If I click on this, what it is going to open is what we call our remote software center. And what remote software center, it kind of, the name, we always joke that we're not great at naming things, that we just kind of call them what they are. And software center or remote software center, you may have gotten it from the context here. It is actually software center, but remote. So I can actually see which updates are showing up on this computer. And I can absolutely kick them off right from here if I want to do that. So I can go ahead and hit start, click them. I can hit install. If I want to do it on individual devices, like I want it on demo 11, but not 10, I can go ahead and hit install from here. And if you notice, it's actually doing feature updates as well. So basically, anything that's showing up as part of your software update group or as part of your software updates will show up in Remote Software Center. The idea, anything that shows up under software updates in Software Center is going to show up in Remote Software Center. The big question that we get a lot with this is, okay, great, you're starting to do my updates for me or for my user. What does that mean to them? And that's a really good question, right? Because a lot of these updates, if you're doing the big updates, they'll require potentially reboots or something like that. It's just as if you were going into Software Center and clicking start. So essentially you're telling it, let's do this feature update right now. And it is going to start doing the install. It is going to adhere to whatever the reboot policies are in your environment. So if you have it set that reboots will only happen at a maintenance window, it'll go ahead and start doing it. and then it will sit and wait until it hits a maintenance window, and then it will go ahead and reboot. Yeah, so the kind of the idea there is, and I do this to our salespeople all the time as they're doing demos and they don't even realize it, is I'll go ahead and get updates started, and then it'll go ahead and do it, and they have enough resources that it's not slowing them down at all. And then by the time they're done in the evening, they'll log off of the computer, and overnight it'll just go ahead and reboot. And when they come back in the morning, it's got the new update, and there wasn't anything they needed to do with it. We just have a couple more minutes, but I want to show you just a couple other things here as well, because we can also see applications that are installed or that are deployed to your device. So this would be applications or packages that are deployed to the device. So you can go ahead and run those remotely right from here. And if they have an uninstall part of the package, or if they're an uninstall part of the application, you can go ahead and click uninstall if you want to remove something. We can also see task sequences right here as well. And the nice thing, even with, it shows up with software updates and task sequences also, is you can actually see the last run error code. So you could potentially look at all of your devices maybe that haven't been able to update and see what the error code was on them right from here without having to try and figure out a different way, or go through that where it shows multiple different, in the deployment where it has multiple different sections of why they failed. You can actually see the error codes right here as well. And then there's the compliance section. So this is essentially like going into your config manager control panel again and running those compliance baselines and having those update. You can select, again, one computer, all computers, just hit evaluate, and it'll go ahead and do that for you. So just wanted to give you a quick idea of what this all is, and what right-click tools is. If you haven't heard of us before, I'm glad that you've heard about us now. Let me go back to my slides here. Ooh, there was a slide, I saw it. Let me just minimize. Oops, we won't do that. And let's go. There we go. So what I wanted to show, there's our let's take a look. Yeah, what I was going to say was, for more information, please go ahead and check us out. It's www.recastsoftware.com. If you'd like a trial of the enterprise version, we have that available. If you would just like to use the community version or need a newer version of community, you absolutely can get that off of this website as well. All right, that's it for me. Thanks, everyone, and thank you for listening.
Cheers, Mike. I love right-click tools. It's awesome.
Thanks.
There was a question. We've probably got a minute to answer it. Somebody asked about the remote permissions required when they're using right-click tools. So, what kind of permissions?
Oh, yeah.
Do they require on the endpoints?
Absolutely. So, out of there, we can actually make it so that there's a couple of different ways that we can set it up. Out of the box, the user who is using the config manager console is using those permissions to try and do actions. So generally that person would need to be a local admin on the computer. However, we do have a couple of other solutions where you can actually use what we call a proxy account. So we would use the service account as that. So if you didn't want to give everybody local admin, which you absolutely shouldn't, you could make it so that you can use a service account to do the action, and just have that service account be local admin. We also have an additional solution that we call the Recast Agent, which is a Recast client essentially that's running on the computer, and then that actually runs as system, which means nobody needs to be local admin on the computer. We have a Recast management server that we use to kind of configure that. But essentially, you could make it so that you don't have anybody who's local admin, and it just uses that system account to do actions.
So awesome.
Yeah, and there's a question: how much does right-click tools cost, and how many endpoints can it manage? go ahead and check out our website and put in a request there to find out more information would be the best way to take a look at that. And endpoints, we have very large organizations. We have very small organizations. So we can probably, we'll find a way to help you out.
Awesome. Thanks, Murray. That was awesome.
Yeah, great.
I think, Dujon, we're good for this session. Yeah.
Yep,
Unless we missed any questions.
No, I
Excellent.
think that's all of them. Yep.
It was great to be on this session with you both. Have an awesome rest of the summit. And see you again soon.
All right. Thanks, everyone.